excited tonight. This is a speaker I have been waiting to hear for a little while here at the museum, so I'm so excited that he's here. Bill MacKinnon, right here in the front, is a respected historian and longtime member of the museum. He is an Air Force veteran and alumnus of Yale and Harvard Business School. In his parallel business and public service careers, he was vice president of General Motors and chairman of the Children's Hospital in Michigan. He's a former sheriff of the Santa Barbara Corral of Westerners. How many Westerners do we have in the audience? Of course. Get them to change the day. So for 65 years, he's researched and written about the American West, producing 5 books and more than 130 articles, which is really incredible. So we feel super lucky to welcome Bill MacKinnon here tonight.
Well, good evening. I'll start with 2 thoughts, one by way of confession, the other a note of thanks. First, I want you to know that tonight's story of a fascinating Irishman who made his way to Santa Barbara in the 1860s was not deliberately scheduled in such close proximity to St. Patrick's Day. It just kind of looks that way. I'm not smart enough to have arranged that. It just worked out that way. Secondly, and more importantly, I want to thank a number of people without whom I could not have assembled this material as I have. Chronologically, I'll start with Kathy Brewster, a longtime docent here. I began corresponding with Kathy more than 20 years ago, in 2003, as a matter of fact, about the O'Neill papers in the Historical Museum's Gledhill Library, and I did that while I was still living in the Detroit area and only occasionally visiting Santa Barbara on vacation. Kathy and Michael Redman were of enormous help to me over the decades that followed, as have in their own ways today's pillars of the Historical Museum's staff. I refer to Emily Alessio, Chris Irvin, and of course, Dacia Harwood. The Historical Museum's longtime supporter and board member, John Woodward, shared antique images from his vast photographic collection to enable us to imagine what Santa Barbara looked like as Dr. O'Neill arrived here a few years after the American Civil War. Thanks especially to several members of the extended and far-flung tribe of Owen Hugh O'Neill's descendants by blood and marriage, especially Carol O'Neill of California's Rolling Hills Estates on the Palos Verdes Peninsula, and Clyde Warren of Grants Pass, Oregon, and the San Simeon Creek Ranch on the coast just north of Cambria. They've enriched our understanding of who Dr. O'Neill was, what he accomplished, and even what he looked like in a way only they could do. I'm glad I found them, or they found me. Thanks also to other members of the O'Neill family. They happen to all be named Warren at this point because of the way family trees branch out. But they are O'Neills. They are direct descendants in the case of Dick Warren, a great-grandson of Dr. O'Neill, about whom we're talking tonight. And there are a total of 7 of the Warrens who've driven down here all the way from San Luis Obispo County, specifically Cambria, Cayugas, and Templeton. So I'm wondering if the 7 O'Neill Warrens who are here today would just stand up so you see what a handsome tribe it is. I've got to say, this is one of the best-looking family trees I've ever seen. And as you'll see from some of the photographs, the ancestors were pretty good-looking people also. Well, now on to our story. Understandably, most historians writing about Santa Barbara's most prominent and colorful citizens focus on what these people did once they arrived here. How large were their fortunes? What kind of mansions did they build? What causes did they champion? And that's where the attention's going. It's been that way for decades. This story, tonight's story, is different. It's the never-told tale of how a well-educated but now forgotten Irishman, Owen Hugh O'Neill, made his way to and across the American frontier to Santa Barbara by way of involvement in two of America's greatest undertakings of the 1850s, about which you've probably never heard. Construction of the Pacific Wagon Road project and prosecution of the Utah War of 1857-1858. The Wagon Road was a massive public works project spanning the Trans-Mississippi West, preparatory to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad a decade later. The Utah War was the nation's most extensive and expensive military adventure during the period between the Mexican-American and Civil Wars, and it pitted the Utah Territorial Militia in armed conflict with 1/3 of the U.S. Army. Ever hear of it? From Utah, Mr. O'Neill gravitated to San Francisco, where he taught and went to medical school, and then as a physician, he became a ship's doctor, a profession that then brought him to Santa Barbara and a fortuitous marriage into the ancient California Ortega-Hill family. Instead of building a wharf like John Stearns, developing a harbor like Max Fleischmann, influencing the town's architecture like Pearl Chase, or saving a breed of horses from extinction as Dwight Murphy did, acquiring a Mexican land grant like his brother-in-law Nicholas Den, or amassing a fortune as others did, O'Neill quietly practiced medicine in first Santa Barbara and then in a tiny up-coast ranching community near what's now Orcutt, California. He lost his life prematurely in 1875 at the age of 49 as a result of a heroic foray into a rainstorm to tend a patient. He caught pneumonia. Dr. O'Neill left behind his widow, a newborn daughter, and a 2-year-old namesake. That little boy, Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr., became the father of 12 children, one of Santa Barbara's first historians. He was this county's professional surveyor for 31 years and a respected member of Santa Barbara's City Council thereafter. The full story of Owen Hugh O'Neill Sr.'s pre-Santa Barbara travels and travails is unknown, I think, even to his descendants in its full scope, obscured as it has been by folklore, public indifference, and incomplete research. I've pieced it together through more than 25 years of pick and shovel work in the records of the National Archives in Washington, the Henry E. Huntington Library in San Marino, California, the Bancroft Library at Cal Berkeley, and the Santa Barbara Historical Museum's own Glen Hill Library. Last summer, some remarkable new material came to me serendipitously thanks to the widow of one of Dr. O'Neill's great-grandsons and the son of an O'Neill granddaughter. And I've received even more information tonight. I'm glad I came to this meeting.
Yeah.
I mean, this stuff keeps coming, and I'm delighted after all these years when I scrounged around for it. I'm just delighted that all of you are here and that some of you have brought O'Neill memorabilia and artifacts with you. The story of this adventuresome American from Ireland deserves telling. In a minute, I'll do that. For the most part, I'm going to be speaking extemporaneously rather than from a prepared text, keying to photos and maps, many never before seen in Santa Barbara, and in some cases, never seen elsewhere in the United States. As I speak, I invite you to think about why this O'Neill story has been so long, I guess you could call lost, and what it tells us about how history is written, or in this case, not written. For that matter, what lessons are to be learned this evening about your own family story over the decades? If you have questions along the way, don't hesitate to stop and ask me. This is the man of the hour, Dr. Owen Hugh O'Neill Sr. It's a photograph, as you'll hear a little later, that was taken in 1866 in Santa Rosa, California, when he was 41 years old. When I look at it, it tells me that not only was he a handsome Irish immigrant to the United States, but that he'd been through a lot. And I'm going to tell you about what those experiences have been. He looks kind of fatigued and tired, and he had a right to be. So we'll hear the details of his life in a minute.
How old was he at that?
He was 41. He was born in 1825. The photo was taken in Santa Rosa, California, 1866. Here you see a familiar map. Those of you who aren't Irish, and I happen not to be, although my wife Pat is 110% Irish. At least I'm Celtic, I guess. You'll recognize the map from what went on Monday. And I've located the county Tipperary, where Owen Hugh O'Neill was born in 1825, and the little tiny hamlet of Kilross in that county where he grew up. One of the members of the family went back there in, I believe, the 1970s to try to locate the family home, and he had a devil of a time finding Kilross, and once he got there, an even harder time trying to find where the O'Neills were. And after many trips to various taverns and buttonholing locals in Kilross, someone finally directed him to an empty pasture that had 2 stone pillars flanking the entrance to it, and that's all that was left of the O'Neill homestead. But circulating in the family are photographs that were taken subsequent to that trip by various O'Neills who wanted to go to Ireland also. And I understand Clyde Warren and his daughter are probably going to go over there this summer to try to have a photograph taken at that gate to that pasture in Kilross. That's where he was brought up. We don't know a lot about his upbringing, except that he was a student at several private academies. I think they were probably run by the Jesuits. From the documents that he left that we could see, he was a highly educated person. His handwriting and the content of what he wrote and the mathematic exercises that he left in notebooks indicate that he was a good student, very well educated for the time. And so we know that his early years were spent receiving a good basic education rather. There's a mystery of what he did and where he did it for about a 10-year period between the mid-1840s and the mid-1850s. The only information that we have, the family has, about that period was supplied by his son, Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr., who spent much of his life in Santa Barbara, in a document that he produced, a remarkable 26-page typed document that he gave as a Christmas present in December of 1928 to the 11 O'Neill children. And I suppose when the 12th one came along, that one received a copy too. But it's an account of his life, and in it he touches on his father, of what his father was doing during that 10-year period between his upbringing in Kilross and his arrival in the United States. There's no documentary support for the information in that part of the story. I don't doubt that it's true. Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr. was too meticulous, I think, to make things up, but it's what came to him through his mother, Maria Antonio Ortega O'Neill. When Owen Jr.'s father died, Owen was only 2 years old, and they went back to Santa Barbara, so he wasn't hearing this information, which he put down on paper in 1928. He wasn't hearing it from his father, so he was hearing it from his mother and her mother, his grandmother, Rafaela Ortega. And I'm not sure exactly what those two ladies were able to tease out of the folklore and the stories that they had heard over the years. I'm not even quite clear what their command of English was. So by the time it got to Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr. from them, and they in turn having gotten it from his late father, It may have had some irregularities and imprecision to it, but that's our only source for that 10-year period. And the story that Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr. told was kind of an amazing one. It was of his father's upbringing in Ireland during a period of great political unrest. And Owen Sr. joined a group of young men, highly educated people for the most part, referred to as Young Ireland. And their cause was to protest the heavy hand of the British Crown on Ireland. At that point, the island hadn't been partitioned in the way that it is now. It was the island that you see in the map. But the fellows that were part of Young Ireland weren't violent. They weren't engaging in gunfire. This was not an early version of the IRA, but they were political and very outspoken. And the speeches and the talks they gave weren't sympathetic to the British Crown. In fact, the British thought they were subversive. And after a certain number of speeches of that kind, they arrested part of this group, tried them. I think they may have taken them to England to do that, sentenced them to death, and then that sentence was commuted by the Crown to life imprisonment and transportation to a part of Australia that was referred to as Van Diemen's Land. That's the story that Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr. related to the family in 1928. And this is a map from the 1850s that show the penal colonies in Australia where the British sent probably over 55,000 Englishmen and Irishmen and some women for minor criminal offenses and political offenses. They just shipped them out because the jails in England and Ireland were so full, they wanted to get rid of these people. So they sent them this enormous distance on sailing vessels to Australia. As I say, over 55,000 of them. We know that the leader of the Young Ireland group, Thomas Maher, it's pronounced it's spelled meager kind of, but pronounced Maher. My brogue isn't very good these days, but he was the leader, and we know that he was transported along with several members of his group, the Young Ireland group, in 1849. The British, like the Germans during World War II, kept meticulous records on who they imprisoned and executed and punished otherwise. This was not a back-of-the-envelope operation. The records are meticulous. So the names of the people that were transported to Australia, their offenses, the length of their term, how they served it, what their punishments were, what the infractions were, all of that is in writing. And there's no trace of Owen Hugh O'Neill in that group. Thomas Maher, the leader of the group, escaped with help from the United States in 1852 and landed in New York and was almost a national hero. There are records as to who left the island with him. And again, Owen Hugh O'Neill's name is not in that group. So we do know that O'Neill arrived in the United States along the Missouri River in 1856, but how he got there, I've not been able to establish. I've been in contact with the leading authorities on the transportation of convicts to Australia from Ireland, and he's unable to find anything either in this voluminous amount of paperwork that the British generated to document what they were doing. So we don't know whether Owen Hugh O'Neill arrived in the mid-1850s in the United States from Ireland and why, and whether he arrived through Montreal, Boston, New York, or New Orleans, where everybody else did, or whether he arrived directly from Tasmania, the island in the lower right-hand corner of this map where he told his son he had been imprisoned. We just don't know what he was doing and how he was traveling and under what circumstances. But we do know, because there are documentary footprints, that he arrived in 1856 in the Missouri town of Liberty, which you'll see on the right-hand side of this map. So I'm inclined to think that he might have arrived in New Orleans, gone up the Mississippi River, past St. Louis, turned left into the Missouri River, and gone up the Missouri to Liberty. And there he stopped. I think he stopped for about a year in Liberty, Missouri, and tried to figure out the why of it. I think it's because Liberty was one of the major, what they call jumping off points for the Overland Trail. People that were heading west for the gold fields in California or heading to Oregon Territory for better farmland started in many cases at Liberty. And I think he may have stopped there with the thought of going further on the Overland Trail from there. We know that around 1856, while he was there, he started studying medicine. And we also know he befriended a newspaper editor in Liberty whose name was Robert Miller. Miller was the editor of a Liberty, Clay County, Missouri newspaper called the Tribune. And he and Owen Hugh O'Neill became good friends. In 1857, Dr. O'Neill headed west from Liberty, and in the course of getting onto the Overland Trail and going west, he visited and saw several military posts along the trail that were there to protect overlanders from Indians. This is a scene taken at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas Territory. This is the first photograph ever taken of the Oregon Trail. I found it in the Library of Congress around 1982, misfiled in a document collection at the Library of Congress, and published it in an article I wrote in 1983. Nobody had seen photographic images of the Oregon Trail before these were published, and I'm going to show you a couple that rarely have been seen anywhere in the United States, certainly not in Santa Barbara. So this was Fort Leavenworth, a huge Army post that the Army had established on the Missouri River. And what you're seeing here is what an Army post looked like at that time over on the Overland Trail. Most of the buildings were wooden. It wasn't a palisaded fort, although there was still a blockhouse, which you can see in the background. And all of these wooden structures were built by carpenters that the post commander, a colonel, brought in from Syracuse, New York, his hometown, to build this stuff. And the trooper that you see there is a private from the 1st Regiment of Cavalry, proudly displaying his horse.
That's a good horse.
It is a good horse, Kevin. Here's a man who knows horseflesh when he sees it. The only problem was it was the wrong horse for that part of the country. That horse, I can guarantee you, came from either Kentucky, Indiana, or Ohio. It was a beauty, but its size and appearance tells you where it was raised. And a horse of this kind couldn't survive on the Great Plains or in the Rocky Mountains the way an Indian pony could. I mean, an Indian pony could eat sagebrush and all kinds of exotic grasses. An animal like this couldn't survive on that. So the Army had to lug around huge quantities of shelled corn in wagons for every Army campaign to feed their cavalry and dragoon mounts like this one. So while this trooper was very proud of the animal, I'm not sure how comfortable the horse was during this period. So that's Fort Leavenworth, not the traditional fort you see in movies. Sort of a Victorian post, the remnants of the original fort established in the 1830s is the blockhouse. In the rear, the rest of the buildings built by carpenters from Syracuse, New York. As he went further up the Oregon Trail, Mr. O'Neill stopped at Fort Kearny in Nebraska Territory, and that's what this is. And here again, you see an open installation, not a palisaded fort in the traditional movie sense. A lot of tents in the background. Some of those might be a bit for Army troops, some for Indians. Some of the buildings that you see there were made out of sod, bricks of sod like peat that were cut and stacked on top of each other like adobe bricks to form the walls of a structure. And that's Fort Kearny. Again, not a typical place at all, but it was in Nebraska Territory on the Overland Trail. And here we come to yet a further western post. That's Fort Laramie, which was also at the time in Nebraska Territory. Now it's in Wyoming, the state of Wyoming, where that was created. But at that time, in the 1850s, it was in Nebraska Territory. These photos were taken less than a year after Dr. O'Neill went through there. The post was at the confluence of the Laramie River and the Platte. That's what all that water is that you see. It's not an aerial photograph. It's tempting to think it was, but certainly not in 1858, not an aerial photograph. It was taken from one of the hills surrounding the post. And again, you see how open it is and how non-traditional it is based on what we've been told Army installations looked like at that time. At this point, Owen Hugh O'Neill ran into a couple of forces that changed his life forever. Why he was heading west, we're not clear. My guess is that he might have been a gold rusher who wanted to get to California, and that's why he was on the trail. But we don't really know the why of it. He didn't leave any story as to the reasons why he got onto the overland trail. But when he got to Fort Laramie, he encountered something very different than what he'd seen at Fort Kearny and Fort Leavenworth. This was a pretty rough post. This was the edge of the frontier. There was nothing between it and Salt Lake City other than Fort Bridger, which we'll hear about a little later. It was a pretty rough post. 2 months before Owen Hugh O'Neill got here, a drunken infantryman from the 6th Regiment of Infantry, during a 4th of July, 1857 celebration that got out of hand, shot an 11-year-old boy in the leg. And when O'Neill came through the post in August of 1857, that little boy was convalescing. Because of his family's need for cash, he had been hired out to a wagon road party, which I'll mention in a minute, to drive a 50-pound wagon behind a single horse or mule that had an odometer attached to the wheel. And that's how that party and Army detachments measured the distances that they traveled. There were crude odometers made out of wood and brass that had been created to fasten to the wheel of a wagon. And this kid was driving one for $20 a month in order to support his family back in Independence, Missouri. That's what the atmosphere was like at Fort Laramie. What O'Neill also found at Fort Laramie was that wagon road expedition that the 11-year-old boy was working for in a state of disarray. It was to build a stretch of the Pacific Wagon Road that ran from the Missouri River to the eastern border of California, and the superintendent of it was a drunkard who mismanaged the whole thing. And the party was coming apart at Fort Laramie, and the superintendent needed people to replace those who left. And Owen Hugh O'Neill got hired at that point, largely because of his education, his ability with math, and his ability to read and write. At Fort Laramie, while he was seeing all of this unfold, he heard a lot about Utah, which he was going to have to pass through to get to the Pacific coast. And here's a map that was the state of the art at the time he was heading west. It's in my collection, done in 1853. And what you see there in the center of it, that sort of long rectangle, was Utah Territory. Carved out of the Mexican cession after the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848, created as a territory by Congress in September of 1850, and its borders were imprecise. Congress just drew lines on a map like this and said that's Utah Territory. They defined its western border as California's eastern border, but it never defined what California's eastern border was, except to say that it was adjacent to Utah Territory's western border. A lot of ambiguity, and arguments between the two political entities went on for years. And then over on the right-hand side, where you don't see any colored line, was the Continental Divide. And that was what formed the eastern border of Utah Territory when it was created in September of 1850. Again, no precision to it, just kind of conceptual lines drawn because it pleased the Committee of Congress, the Committee on Territories. I mean, they didn't take into account where mountains were, where rivers were, they just sort of did it. And the counties that were created as a result that you see in the center of that map were 700 miles wide. I mean, it was just enormous. That's what Owen O'Neill was hearing about when he was at Fort Laramie. More on the Pacific Wagon Road project that he saw disintegrating at Fort Laramie, Nebraska Territory. Its origins rested in the administration of President Franklin Pierce, with a subsequent push by President Buchanan when he took office in March of 1857, and Congress. Its objective was to link the Mississippi Valley and the Missouri River to the Pacific coast via improvements in existing wagon roads and survey and construction of even new ones. So the mission of this party was to improve what was there and to create new links to the existing web of roads that would take people gold rushing to California or looking for farms in Oregon to the Pacific coast. It was the most ambitious national public works project of its time, perhaps even since the construction of the Erie Canal, which was in the 1820s. It was really big. And its successor was the Transcontinental Railroad, which largely followed its route. The principal beneficiaries were the U.S. Army. The Army sold Congress on the need for such a road, saying it needed a link with the Pacific coast, that it wasn't good enough to send people down to Panama, across the Isthmus, and then up to the west coast to San Francisco. It needed a road to do it. It's a little bit like the argument that President Eisenhower used in the 1950s to construct the national highway system of highways, expressways. It was all done by Congress in the name of national defense, not for the benefit of tourists like us, but for the defense, so the Army and the Air Force could get around in a way that they couldn't when the only national roads were things like the Lincoln Highway, Route 30, or maybe Route 66. So the argument that Ike used in the 1950s was the same one that was used by Presidents Pierce and Buchanan and their Army. The other beneficiaries were Western immigrants, as I mentioned, who were gold rushers or homesteaders headed for Oregon. There were some negative implications to such a road, especially as the tribes they passed through saw it. It disrupted their hunting grounds, created all kinds of chaos, and the Mormons, who had been in Utah for 10 years at this point, were ambivalent. They viewed it as a plus for all the reasons I cited, but they also viewed it as a potential negative because it was going to bring into the Salt Lake Valley and across it a lot of people who weren't Mormons and who they viewed as undesirable, some of them from the states where they'd been kicked out of during the prior 10 years, states like Missouri and Illinois. So the Mormons had mixed feelings about the Pacific Wagon Road project. Organizationally, responsibility for building this road, which Owen O'Neill heard about and was eventually hired by, was lodged with the Secretary of the Interior, Jacob Thompson. And the selection of routes and the superintendents who were going to survey and build all this was highly politicized, running to what sections of the country do they live in, and what were the patronage appointments that the White House could dole out in connection with such a project. Our focus tonight, because of Dr. O'Neill's involvement, was on the segment that ran from Fort Kearny on the Overland Trail through South Pass, across Utah to the eastern border of California at Honey Lake. That's how they described it. This was the superintendent I mentioned who was presiding over the wreck of a major national project. His name was William Miller Finney McGraw. He was from Maryland originally. He got his job as superintendent of that stretch of the road because of political connections. One of his brothers was courting the niece of President Buchanan in the White House while all this was taking place, and other brother who lived in Pennsylvania was the treasurer of the Democratic Party at the time. So McGraw was Exhibit A for patronage appointments to jobs that went with the project. His segment of the Pacific Wagon Road was in such disarray because he was a drunkard. He dawdled at Independence before starting off for months. It alarmed people. He spent much of the appropriation for the project before he even left Independence, Missouri. He was just a disaster, and everybody that worked for him knew it, which is in part why there was a revolt when the Wagon Road project got to Fort Laramie. He had managed to pit the professional engineers, surveyors, and clerks and other admin types against the Irish laborers who were actually building the project, doing literally the pick and shovel work on the roads and building bridges. They were pitted against the well-educated people that were part of this, and that was part of the conflict. You would have thought when Owen O'Neill was hired to replace some of the people that left that he'd have a close rapport with the Irish workforce, but it didn't work out that way. What we find in letters and diaries was references to him as being English, and I think that ran to his education, that he wasn't viewed by the Irish laborers in the group as an Irishman in the sense he thought he was, but they viewed him as a person whose educational level, even accent, was different than theirs.
So what means were they using to separate those two groups?
What names?
Well, the Irish laborers versus the engineer. What was the context for their controversy?
Well, in terms of how they were treated, what food they got, how they were paid, those were the principal distinctions. It was sort of like the distinctions between enlisted men and officers in the military, only more extreme, and without the structure and the rules of regulation that the Army had. It was a sort of a sociological disaster. At the time all of this was unfolding at Fort Laramie, the Utah War was underway. So these two major efforts in the American West were taking place simultaneously in almost the same place. And this chart outlines what the Utah War was. I'm not going to go over this at great length. I've written a number of books about it, but that's not the subject of tonight's talk. But I just want to mention in summary that it was the struggle for power and authority in Utah between Governor Brigham Young, who was also the president of the Mormon Church, and President James Buchanan, who had just come into office on March 4th of 1857. The Mormons came to view this as a religious war to destroy Mormonism and polygamy, which it wasn't. Buchanan was too good a lawyer to get caught up in that. And by the way, there was no federal statute against polygamy. So polygamy as practiced by the Mormons in secret up until 1852 and then publicly after 1852 wasn't illegal under federal statutes. There was no federal polygamy law until Abraham Lincoln signed an anti-bigamy law in 1862, and distracted by the Civil War, Lincoln announced he wasn't going to enforce it. So this was not a war against polygamy, although there were a lot of hard feelings about it. Buchanan, when he came into office in March of 57, felt a need to restore federal authority after 10 years of territorial and federal conflict and violence on about almost every subject. And one of the leaders of this conflict was our man, WMF McGraw, who was the superintendent of the Wagon Road project. Before the Wagon Road was created, he was in Utah writing letters to the president about how out of control Brigham Young was and how he needed to be replaced and sent west with an Army escort. And that was the solution that James Buchanan rested on within a couple of weeks after he took office in March of 57. His solution was to replace Young as governor send a new governor west with a large army escort, which, as I said, grew to be almost 1/3 of the entire army. As that unfolded, a nasty territorial federal dispute morphed into a morbid rebellion that had a regional and even international impact. I'm not going to go into what all that is, but if anybody's intrigued by it, we can maybe do it during the Q&A session. But it was a conflict that got the attention of the British government, the Russian government, the Mexican government, the Kingdom of Hawaii, the Netherlands. All of those countries thought they had a dog in the fight in the American West with the Utah War, and that was one of the colorful parts of it. The conflict spawned unprecedented atrocities, just a huge loss of life during the course of it, not because of mass battles like the Civil War, but by ambushes and assassinations in twos and threes or groups of 6. And the worst one was at Mountain Meadows in southern Utah in September of 1857, where an entire wagon train was wiped out. These were people from Arkansas heading for California by way of southern Utah, and a battalion of the Utah Territorial Militia fell on it, killed everybody except 17 children that they thought were too young to talk. Everybody else they put to death. It's the darkest stain on the reputation of the Mormon Church that it's still trying to explain and live down. It was also so expensive that it bankrupted the U.S. Treasury, literally. When Lincoln took office a couple of years later, the folklore is that he didn't have enough money to buy stationery. And as I say, it stained the reputation of the Mormon Church. After leaving Fort Laramie, the Wagon Road Project and later the Utah expedition headed through South Pass, and McGraw, the superintendent, became aware that the Mormon Navajo Legion had a price on his head and was putting out orders to bring him in to Salt Lake City, dead or alive. And being aware of that and the approach of winter, he decided to take his party into winter quarters in the Wind River Mountains, just north of South Pass and the Overland Trail, at a place they called Fort Thompson. You see that in the upper right-hand corner, named after the Secretary of the Interior. And this is about the only map you're ever going to see that has Fort Thompson located. It just disappeared after this campaign was over. So the Wagon Road Project built a palisaded fort there, very different than the forts that you saw before, to defend themselves against Mormon attack and against raids by the Crows and the Shoshones, who spent the winter in this part of the Wind River Mountains. And they spent a couple of months building this enormous palisaded fort, and because they were engineering troops, civilian employees, they were able to build all kinds of exotic features. I mean, wrought iron hinges to doors and things of that sort. And it's all recorded in Owen Hugh O'Neill's journals. He kept a day-by-day record of what they were doing and where and in what way, which are all down in the National Archives at this point. Never been seen in Santa Barbara, but it's there. And at some point, I hope to be able to publish the text. While they were at Fort Thompson, the Army continued on west and ended up stopping at Fort Bridger, which the Mormons had burned in October of 1857, knowing that the Army was approaching. And that's where the Army was while the Wagon Road Project was at Fort Thompson. This is just a field map that was drawn by O'Neill's colleagues. This is part of the records in the National Archives. It shows you sort of the rough field notes they made. Fort Thompson is located on here, about the middle upper part of the map. It's the only contemporary map I've been able to find that locates Fort Thompson. The Army continued on to the ruins of Fort Bridger, and all the wooden structures had been burned by the Mormons in October of 1857. This photograph was taken in June of 1858 by the photographer who took the early photographs that I showed you. And the walls that you see here were built of cobblestone that the Mormons built before they knew they were going to burn it.
And that's the former Fort Bridger?
That's what Fort Bridger looked like, yes. After the Mormons burned it, the only thing left were those cobblestone walls. So the Army took refuge in there as winter approached. Snow was falling, it was cold, and they went into winter quarters mainly in tents. They used the walls as cover for storage for quartermaster supplies. And so the Army spent the winter of 1857-58 at Fort Bridger and a nearby tent encampment named after Whitfield Scott, the general-in-chief, called Camp Scott. They lived in tents at an altitude of 7,000 feet in brutal weather. It was a tough winter for the Army. It wasn't exactly Valley Forge, but a close second. So while the Wagon Road Party was in the Wind River Range at what they called Fort Thompson, they'd build out of logs as a palisaded fort. This is where the U.S. Army's Utah expedition was. This is just a sketch of the tents and the stone and adobe fireplaces that the troops built. This was drawn by an infantry captain, and that's Black's Fork of the Green River that's flowing past it. This shows you another sketch by that same captain, which sort of mirrors the photograph that I showed you a second ago. That's how he depicted the fort and its cobblestone walls. And this was a similar sketch done by an infantry private at a different regiment, and you'll see they're very similar in some ways.
So was Fort Bridger, I mean, did it have a lot of structures more than you see there?
No. No, most of them were burned, Kevin, and they were all within sort of fence rails, and and in the summer of 1857, anticipating that the Army was going to come, the Mormons built this. They kicked Jim Bridger out of his own fort, built the cobblestone walls, and got ready for the arrival of the Army. And then when the Army left Fort Laramie and they knew it was going to continue going west, they burned the whole place. And just those cobblestone walls survived. Mm-hmm. So that's where the Army was, and in March of 1858, the colonel commanding the Army decided that the Wagon Road Party, including Owen Hugh O'Neill in the Wind River Range, was too exposed, that they were vulnerable to attack by the Mormon militia and by the Crows and the Shoshones, and that he better bring them to Fort Bridger to protect them and to make use of the tools and the animals that they had with them. So he ordered them, even though they weren't in the Army, they were civilians, he ordered them to abandon Fort Thompson and to come to Fort Bridger. And the last entries that appear in Owen O'Neill's journal were the march from Fort Thompson to Fort Bridger, which was maybe 50, 60 miles away. They had to go south from the Wind River Mountains to the Overland Trail, then west to Fort Bridger. And very soon after Fort Thompson was abandoned by the Wagon Road Project, the Crows burned it. There's no trace of it left. It was on a stream called the Papaji River in the foothills of the Wind Rivers. And the Crows just swooped down after the Wagon Road Party left for Fort Bridger and burned the whole place. They didn't occupy it or try to make any use of it. While Owen Hugh O'Neill was at Fort Bridger, starting in March of 1858, he used the time to sort out and regularize and neat up the records of the Wagon Road Party, which were in such disarray under Superintendent McGraw's excesses. And he got into a conflict with the superintendent over possession of brass navigational and surveying instruments that O'Neill felt he should retain possession of in order to safeguard them and return them to the federal government rather than turn them over to McGraw as he demanded, because O'Neill was pretty sure that that the brass surveying instruments were just going to be turned into bourbon if he did that. So he kept them. Superintendent McGraw brought a lawsuit against Owen Hugh O'Neill at Fort Bridger. Can you believe that at an altitude of 7,000 feet in the wilderness in the Rocky Mountains, they were engaging in lawsuits? There were actually lawyers that were camp followers of the Army, and they were defending O'Neill while others were helping McGraw prosecute him. I mean, it's just kind of an unbelievable scene. Of course, this encampment at Fort Bridger at Camp Scott that abutted it was the largest military garrison in North America at the time. So there were lots of people, lots of camp followers there. And so O'Neill spent part of his time defending himself against accusations by his former boss. What he also did was decided to see for himself what this conflict was between the Army and the Mormons. He hadn't seen a Mormon yet at this point, of course. So even though the colonel commanding the Army's Utah expedition had forbade civilians to go any further west at Fort Bridger, O'Neill found a way to go into Fort Bridger with the new governor, to go into Salt Lake City with the new governor and 2 peace commissioners that the president sent west to try to settle this affair. He went with the 2 peace commissioners and the new governor to Salt Lake City from Fort Bridger in June of 1858. And the reason why the president sent the peace commissioners out was this was becoming a tremendous embarrassment to him. I mean, he hadn't succeeded in getting the Army into Salt Lake City. He hadn't succeeded in installing his new governor. The cost of it was literally bankrupting the country, and what was going on alongside of it was the worst economic recession in the United States in 20 years. The recession of 1857 was the worst one since 1837. And the unemployment rates in the country were just disastrous, and to be spending money on a campaign against Mormons struck much of the public as kind of not the right priority. And as I say, it crippled the ability of the Lincoln administration that followed to prosecute the Civil War for the first 2 months of the war. I mean, I mentioned the story about Lincoln being unable to buy stationery. Well, I mean, if you look through the records, you see he was writing out important documents on plain paper. There was no engraved stationery or anything of that sort. So Buchanan was embarrassed and wanted to get this thing settled. So he sent 2 peace commissioners west from Washington to Fort Bridger and then on to Salt Lake City with Owen O'Neill accompanying them. And the 2 peace commissioners, there was no commission, by the way. They were just 2 guys who were called commissioners, were very unusual people. One of them was a man named Ben McCullough, a very tough hombre who was Buchanan's first choice to be Brigham Young's successor, but he declined the job, saying the Mormons would be too terrified by him going into that occupation. McCullough was at that time a legend in Texas. He served in the Texas Revolution, he served in the Mexican War, and he was, at this time that he was sent west to be a peace commissioner, was the U.S. Marshal for the Eastern District of Texas. And the other commissioner was Lazarus W. Powell, he was the former governor of Kentucky and a senator-elect from Kentucky in the U.S. Senate. Those were the 2. And they brought with them a proclamation from President Buchanan declaring a blanket pardon to the entire population of Utah on 2 conditions. One, they would accept Alfred Cumming as Brigham Young's successor as governor, and 2, that they would obey federal authority and law. And if they did that, agreed to do it, then this blanket pardon or amnesty for the entire population of Utah, 50 or 60,000 people, would go into effect. And that's what the peace commissioners brought with them to Salt Lake City to lay on Brigham Young from Fort Bridger. And it wasn't just a single piece of paper. They brought bushel baskets full of this document. They had it printed, typeset and printed at Fort Leavenworth before they moved across the Overland Trail. And so they lugged thousands and thousands of copies of this presidential proclamation amnestying the entire territory once Brigham Young agreed to those 2 terms. The scene in Salt Lake City was a strange one. When Owen O'Neill got there around June 9th of 1858, it was empty. It was the biggest city between the Missouri River and San Francisco, and it was empty. Oh, there were maybe 20 or 30 Mormon militiamen who had been detailed to burn the whole place if Brigham Young gave the word. The strategy was, if the army didn't behave itself, all of northern Utah and all of Salt Lake City was to be burned, and the entire population of northern Utah and the city of Salt Lake City and the towns below it all were put on the road south to an unknown destination that many people thought was Mexican Sonora. That's what was happening. That's why Salt Lake City was empty when O'Neill got there. And this is one version of what he saw in June of 1858. It's the city of Salt Lake City and the Wasatch Mountains east of it. And I'm not going to vouch for the accuracy of it. This appeared in Harper's Weekly magazine in New York later in the summer of 1858. I'm not sure the artist ever really was there. I think he drew it, and it was engraved and printed in Harper's Weekly from accounts of people who had been there and wrote about it. So I think there's some exaggeration here, but when Owen O'Neill got to Salt Lake City with the commissioners, that's supposedly what he saw. Maybe a more accurate version of what he saw was this street scene in Salt Lake City. It's unpaved, dirty. The buildings were principally adobe because the lumber was very scarce. And this was a typical street scene. And in the background on the right, you see one of the principal church buildings. And the building with the sign out in front of it was a blacksmith shop. The blacksmith was another Irish immigrant, but he had converted to Mormonism. And that's, again, what O'Neill would have seen. So he stayed in Salt Lake City while the commissioners came up, and Brigham Young came up from Provo, where many of the Mormons were in a holding pattern waiting to go to Sonora. And on June 9th, while he was here, he wrote a letter to Editor Miller back in Liberty, Missouri, describing what was going on. And he described the fact that the commissioners were about to engage in discussions with Brigham Young about the proclamation of amnesty. He hoped that it would take place. And the long letter that he wrote back to Liberty, Missouri, and his friend, the newspaper editor, was unlike any other newspaper reporter's correspondence that I've read. I've been through, in the course of 65 years, the letters that maybe 20 or 25 reporters who were with the Army wrote back to their newspapers in New York or Boston or in some cases London. They were all highly critical of Mormonism. Some of them urged that Brigham Young and the 12 apostles be lynched immediately. They were all very negative, very critical. O'Neill's letters back to Liberty, Missouri were different. And I've got some of them here, but I'm not going to read them because we're running out of time. But people who are interested in it can get a hold of me. And I hope if this lecture is published, as I hope it will be, that I'll certainly include Owen O'Neill's letters to those newspapers. He also wrote some to the New York Tribune. The letters differed from those of his peers, the other correspondents, in the sense that he was sympathetic to what the Mormons had created out of a desert. They had just done unbelievable things with irrigation during the 10 years before O'Neill saw it for the first time. And he was really impressed, and he said so in his letter to Robert Miller, the editor. He also expressed sympathy for what the Mormons had been through in being expelled from Illinois and Missouri and places like that. So the letter had a positive cast to it, that these weren't evil people. He wasn't carrying the torch for polygamy, of course. He kind of stayed away from that subject. But he was very sympathetic and expressed it in terms of what the Mormons had accomplished and what kind of people were they. He talked about the character of the appearance and the demeanor and the behavior of the people he saw in Salt Lake City. Very different than any other thing that other reporters had written. I think the reason for that was because of his Irish background, that he had seen the heavy hand of the British Crown on his people. He had seen what the power of government and standing armies can do. And he kind of was for the underdog. That was his bias, and it came through in the letters that he wrote. He certainly wasn't Mormon, and he had no connection to the church or Utah for that matter. He was just kind of calling it the way that he saw it. He left, went back to Fort Bridger, wrote another letter to the New York Tribune, and then the two peace commissioners and Brigham Young hashed out a settlement. The new governor was accepted. Brigham Young ceded the governorship, agreed to abide by federal law, and the proclamation went into effect and was distributed throughout the territory, and it's now a collector's item on the rare book and manuscript market. I mean, I bought a copy a couple of years ago for more than I'd care to admit and donated it to the Utah State Historical Society. But it's a very interesting document. O'Neill went back to Fort Bridger while this peace and amnesty were being kneaded up and put into effect. And he stayed there for about another year. We're not sure what he did, except I know that he voted in the local election on August 2nd of 1858. He's recorded as having voted. Whether he was a citizen or not, I have no idea. I'm not quite sure where he did get his U.S. citizenship. But when he wrote his last will and testament in April of 1875, the day before he died, he described himself as being from Ireland, but a citizen of the United States. So somewhere along the line, he did become a citizen. Around 1859, he went further west to California. We're not sure by what route. There's folklore in the family about that. One of the stories that O'Neill Jr. Said in that remarkable 1928 document to his 11 children was that Owen Sr. had been in the Army at Fort Bridger with the topographical engineers. And he, of course, never was in the Army, but he was around it a lot. So it's understandable if people were confused. And the son said that his father told him that he had gone west to California with Albert Sidney Johnson, the commander of the troops. And that wasn't the case at all, because Johnson stayed in the desert south of Salt Lake City for another couple of years while Owen Sr. went west to San Francisco. But that's one of the ambiguities in the story that I'd love to clarify. He got to San Francisco in 1859, and I'm not going to go into what he saw there, but it was a remarkable scene of chaos and violence and wealth. The best way to get a handle on what Owen O'Neill saw in San Francisco, and he left no record of it, is to read the appendix to Charles Henry Dana's 2 years before the Mass. The appendix is called 24 Years Later, something that he added to 2 years before the Mass in 1859 when he went back to the West Coast to see what had happened. And he described San Francisco, and it would have been the same town that Owen O'Neill saw. What Owen did in San Francisco is documented. He taught because of his superior education and skills in math, Greek, and Latin. He taught at a number of private Jesuit schools and did quite well there. And in the early 1860s, he decided he was going to resume the medical studies that he started in Liberty, Missouri in 1856. So he did that, and he was in, I think, either the first or the second graduating class of the med school of the University of the Pacific in downtown San Francisco. The university itself was in Stockton, but the med school was in San Francisco. He attended it and was part of a tiny class that graduated in 1864. And what he did after that was not to go back to teaching, but he got a job as a ship's doctor with his newly minted MD degree. And he worked as a ship's doctor for the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, a private enterprise subsidized by the U.S. government to deliver mail and passengers between San Francisco and the west coast of Panama. That's what he was doing, and what you see here are the dockyards of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. Those are the mass of steamships and sailing vessels that O'Neill would have been involved with at that time. And get some feel for sort of the clutter and the excitement of San Francisco from that. I love that photograph. That's the type of ship that he was on as he plied between San Francisco and Panama. And somewhere along the line, he stopped at Santa Barbara. I think it was in 1869. He would have come ashore through the surf in a lifeboat because there was no Stearns Wharf at that time. Everything came into Santa Barbara before 1872 by being dumped overboard by ships anchored in the channel, and if it floated to the beach, great. If it didn't, well, that's the way it went. And humans that came to Santa Barbara came through the surf. It wasn't a case of tying up at a wharf in 1869. So this ship would have probably been anchored in the roadstead off of Santa Barbara. He would have gone ashore, and he stayed and struck up all kinds of relationships, decided to stay, and started the practice of medicine in downtown Santa Barbara. This is what he would have seen as he was coming ashore through the surf. There was no Stearns Wharf. This is the channel and the harbor, what's now the harbor of Santa Barbara. I think this painting, which was a watercolor made in 1855, was probably made from somewhere up by City College. And you see two ships there, one sailing vessel and one steamer. Those were Navy vessels that the government had sent out to find out what it was it had really gotten out of the Mexican War. I mean, there were no lighthouses or no charts to explain what the Pacific coast of the United States looked like after the Mexican War. So in 1855, the Navy was set out to take soundings and create depth charts for mariners in this new part of the United States. And these two vessels were part of it, and on board was a young guy, a civilian, whose brother was the naval lieutenant commanding one of the ships, and he would go ashore periodically wherever they were, either up in the Pacific Northwest or down near San Diego, or in this case, Santa Barbara, and do paintings and sketches of what he was seeing. And this was a watercolor of Santa Barbara and its beach and its incipient harbor in 1855. That's kind of what the place would have looked like for Dr. O'Neill. Here's another view of Santa Barbara. I got this through the courtesy of John Woodward. It's, I think, State Street, and it was taken, according to John, around 1875, so it's a little more developed than when O'Neill arrived in 1869, and you could tell it was 1875 because this building on the left is of fired brick, not adobe, and that means that brick would have come in from San Francisco on a ship that tied up at the new Stearns Wharf. Prior to that time, Santa Barbara wasn't wood and it wasn't fired brick, it was adobe because of the lack of building materials and the expense of importing brick. But this building was made of brick, so that dates it somewhat. The blurring that you see in the picture is the motion of the horses just kind of backing and filling with their riders trying to control them. The lenses on the cameras were so bad that you get blurring in images this early. This was part of the collection of two photographers named Hayward and Moselle that John Woodward has devoted a huge amount of time collecting. Interesting to me, just as an aside, that Santa Barbara didn't have photographs until 1875, but yet as early as 1850, up in the Sierra gold camps, there were photographers crawling all over the place taking photographs of gold miners who wanted to send them home. But Santa Barbara was so isolated without a wharf and in such a bubble that no photographer got there till about 1875. That's interesting to me. The other thing that Dr. O'Neill would have seen, if like most tourists, he hired a buggy and gone out to Montecito, which was largely a cattle range, with Hispanic vaqueros tending the herds, he would have seen La Parra Grande, this enormous grapevine that an Hispanic family built in Montecito, and they charged visitors 10 cents to come in and look at it. I mean, this produced unbelievable quantities of grapes for wine, so much so that it was probably the biggest grape arbor in the world at the time. Just one of the real curiosities about this part of the world in the 1850s and 60s. Later, probably fairly soon after this picture was taken, the grapevine died, and what they did in Montecito was to chop it up, disassemble it, including the perugula, and ship it all to Philadelphia for the 1876 centennial of the American Revolution, and they reassembled it. And this was one of the principal California exhibits that appeared in 1876 in Philadelphia to show what California was like. I mean, it was dead, and it was in pieces which had to be reassembled, but that was it, La Para Grande, and there's still a little street that parallels Montecito Creek and Montecito called La Para Grande. I think Prince, yes, it did. I think Prince Harry lives a little above Para Grande. Well, aside from the look of Santa Barbara, what Dr. O'Neill found when he got off that Pacific Mail steamship to settle in Santa Barbara in 1869 was a county and a city in absolute turmoil. There was continuing violence in the post-gold rush era, a lot of shootings, a lot of killings, whole gangs of villains up in Arroyo Burro near, what's the beach where the restaurant is?
Boathouse.
Yeah, it's where the boathouse is. That's where the villains were hiding. There was a water source up there, and it got even worse as you went north. When you got up into San Luis Obispo, the number of murders were unbelievable. The sheriff of Los Angeles was assassinated a couple of times. I mean, the ability to maintain law and order was almost non-existent. Santa Barbara was better than some places, but not a whole lot. That was part of the atmosphere that he entered. Also, in 1860-61, before he got there, there had been devastating rainstorms during the winter of 1860-61. And then these rainstorms were followed by 2 or 3 or 4 years of really tough drought. They wiped out the entire cattle trade in Santa Barbara County. It was a real blow, and what went with it was the hide and tallow trade, on which Santa Barbara and the ranchos around it had been dependent since the 1820s. All that went to the wall with the loss of the cattle herds, and Santa Barbara County hasn't been the same since then. Aside from the shift in Santa Barbara's economic and societal balance the loss of a domination by pastoral, isolated California or Hispanic families, and a change to a world led by Yankee, Anglo, and European newcomers, some of them often single, with technical, entrepreneurial, and professional know-how that the Californians did not have, including how to properly survey a ranch. That's why many of the Californians lost their properties. They had no documentation or no accurate documentation, and it was a big game changer, a huge turnover. And Dr. O'Neill was, in a sense, part of this shift. When you look at where he came from, what his education was, what he did, it was very different than being in with the vaqueros herding 10 or 15,000 head of cattle across the county. That was another feature of what he entered. He obviously struck up a friendship with the Ortega Hill family. This was the patriarch of that family. That's Daniel Hill, who originated in Massachusetts near Boston, arrived in Santa Barbara in 1823, married after converting to Catholicism and becoming a Mexican national in 1826. He died in 1865 and is buried in the mission's graveyard. So he died in 65 before Dr. O'Neill arrived, but that didn't prevent Dr. O'Neill from striking up a friendship with the Ortega Hill family, and he was especially attracted to this lady, Maria Antonio Hill, later O'Neill. This was a photograph taken in 1902 when, let's see, she was born in 1843, so she would have been, at that point, my math is failing me, but I know. Okay, thank you, Kevin. So this was late in life for her as a widow. the mother of 2 children, Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr., who was an adult when this was taken in 1902, and Adelaide O'Neill, her daughter, who gravitated to San Diego and married an Englishman, a strikingly handsome woman, as was her husband. And they were married in 1870, while Dr. O'Neill tried to establish a medical practice in Santa Barbara. They had 1 child who died in 1871, Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr., and he's buried in the Santa Barbara Cemetery, which was established at just about that time. So the little boy must have been one of the first people to be buried in the new Santa Barbara Cemetery. And the name was later used again for Dr. O'Neill's son, who became the surveyor of Santa Barbara County. So there are 2 Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr.'s in a sense. The name was, if you'll excuse the expression, recycled, as happened during that period several times. In 1871, they decided to leave the city of Santa Barbara and to go up the coast into the northernmost part of the county near San Luis Obispo to a little hamlet called Graciosa. And I think the reason why the O'Neills left Santa Barbara was because Dr. O'Neill was probably uncomfortable competing with 2 or 3 other doctors who had arrived in town. The loss of his son in 1871 may have been a factor. And maybe Mrs. O'Neill's desire to go back to the area that she'd grown up in was a factor also. Although the Ortega family was basically based in Santa Barbara, Daniel Hill chose to leave Santa Barbara after he built the adobe on Carrillo Street, and he built it in 1826, and in 1836 they sold that house and went up to the Ortega Ranch up county. The ranch was called Rancho Nuestra Senora de la Refugio. My Spanish is terrible, but it was known as the Refugio Ranch, and she was born in a small canyon in one corner of the ranch, grew up there before she went down to Santa Barbara, where she met Dr. O'Neill, and I think she may have felt more comfortable being up there, and that's where they went. They didn't go to that ranch, but they went to Graciosa near it, and that was a little crossroads or hamlet that had been developed after the Portola expedition went through in 1769. The Portola expedition, which discovered San Francisco Bay from the land, crossed through this area in 1769, and they camped at La Graciosa because of an attractive freshwater lagoon that they found among the sand dunes. And those of you who are better Spanish speakers than I am know what the connection is between that name and that word and the concept of still attractive waters. And that's what they recorded, that they camped near this pleasant freshwater lagoon, and that's how the place got its name. In 1871, it was just a crossroads. There was a general store there, a stage stop, and there were several stage roads which crisscrossed through that area. It was sort of midway between San Luis Obispo County and the city of Santa Barbara, and that's why it's there. And I think another reason why the O'Neills may have gravitated to it was at that time people looked on this hamlet as potentially the number 2 city in Santa Barbara County after the city of Santa Barbara. Santa Maria basically didn't exist. It was a house or 2 or 3 at the most. And the feeling was that Graciosa was going to be the second city of Santa Barbara County, and that may have influenced the doctor. Anyway, he got there, he established his practice. As I say, there was a general store and not much else. In his practice, and he had no competition from other physicians, throughout this vast area was on horseback. And his son later explained that some of his travels to 10 patients took him all the way over in the east to Coyama, near the what became the Ventura County line. I mean, it was just colossal. He rode horseback constantly, was being paid not in gold and silver, but with produce, sides of bacon, things of that sort. I mean, there was almost no cash economy up there. It was all barter and trade, and that's how Dr. O'Neill was paid.
Is that Graciosa considered orchid today?
Yes. Well, I'll explain in a minute how it got to be orchid, Kevin, but you're right. In 1875, Dr. O'Neill went out in a rainstorm on horseback to tend a patient. I'm not sure where that person lived. By folklore, it was a little girl. And he came back home after a while and caught pneumonia. And he died within a couple of days. And Clyde Warren, one of the members of the O'Neill family, the one who lives up in Grants Pass, Oregon, has a copy. He has the one-page will that Dr. O'Neill dictated on his deathbed the day before he passed away. It's a remarkable document. I hope to see that published also. So he died, leaving his widow, Maria Antonia, a 2-year-old son, Owen Jr., and a 2-month-old daughter, Adelaide. And they had no way to earn a living, and so they went back to Santa Barbara and lived with Raphael Ortega Hill, her mother, and they lived with her for a couple of years until she died. And Owen Jr. has left an account of how unpleasant it was living not with his grandmother, he loved her, but her second husband, after Daniel Hill had died in 1865, was not very helpful at all to him and his little sister. And as soon as the grandmother, Raffaella, died, he ejected them from the household. And they had to live in a small cottage through the help of friends. And the mother, Maria Antonio O'Neill, did needlework to support the family. And one of her descendants has tonight, the first time I've ever seen it, photographs of the wonderful needlework that she did. I mean, the original needlework is somewhere in the family, but the photographs were brought here tonight. I'd never seen them before. It's another example of the power of asking questions and reaching out to people. So Owen O'Neill Jr., as a small boy, lived in a bilingual culture. He told his descendants in writing in 1928 that his mother had beaten the Spanish language into him and his sister at Adelaide with a switch, but then he paused and he said, but it was well worth it, that it was used to good effect, because after years of stitched together employment in Santa Barbara, O'Neill Jr. went to Mexico, starting in 1902. And he worked all over Mexico. He worked on banana plantations in Chiapas and on the Yucatan Peninsula. He worked for a copper company in Sonora. He spent time in Acapulco. I mean, he put the Spanish language to great use before he came back for good after marrying a U.S. citizen in Benson, Arizona in 1910. He came back for good in 1911 and spent the rest of his life here, which I won't go into in detail, but it's worth another talk just to hear about the adventures he had in Santa Barbara and in Mexico. Just one last word about La Graciosa. This is a map that was drawn in 1872 and sent to Washington to support a petition to create a post office there. And this shows you a rough sketch of where it is in relation to the Santa Barbara County line, the San Luis Obispo line, and the Santa Ynez River. But this is what was sent to Washington to persuade the government to create a post office there. The O'Neills left in 1875 to go back to live with the Ortegas in Santa Barbara. But to answer Kevin's question, there is no La Graciosa now, because 2 years after the O'Neills left, Henry Mayo Newhall gained control of all the ranch property around it, convinced himself and the courts that the residents of La Graciosa were squatters without title to the land, and he cleared all of them off forcibly. The place became abandoned, and Newhall then burned it to the ground, and there's not a trace of it left. As near as they could tell from earlier accounts and descriptions of where it was And these crude maps, it's where the town of Orcutt is now. But there's no landmark like a building foundation or anything, no signage that survived. That's why you can't find it now. But the closest we can come to saying where it is, it's somewhere underneath the town of Orcutt. And then this is the tombstone for Dr. Owen Hugh O'Neill Sr. It's in Guadalupe. I think that may have been the nearest Catholic cemetery to La Graciosa where he died. They certainly, the circumstances were such they couldn't take him back to Santa Barbara for burial the way that Daniel Hill was buried at the mission. But this is the stone that was created that recorded the bare outlines of his life, his birth, and his death. And his son, Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr., is buried in the Cambria cemetery because that's where he chose to live after he retired from city government in 1949. He went up coast to Cambria, and that's why so many of the O'Neills and the Warrens are in that part of San Luis Obispo County. So that is his story. I want to add one other word of thanks, and that is to this man's son, Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr., because without the meticulous records he left, although a little vague in support on some of the items, were just magnificent. As a surveyor, he was trained in the importance of accuracy, and I just want to thank him because of the importance of what he left behind, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And in that connection, I want to leave you with one sentence that was recorded on tape by J. Edwin Gladhill, whose name is connected to the library in this institution, of course. Mr. Gladhill went up to Cambria to interview Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr., whom he befriended when he was in county government here and on the city council. And he took with him a tape recorder. And during the course of 1954 and the next year or two, he recorded a lot of interviews. And the information that came out of these interviews, which are available here, supplement the 1928 26-pager that O'Neill Jr. created for his children. And in the course of that taped interview, Owen Hugh O'Neill Jr. said to Edwin Gledhill that he had a piece of advice for any family. At this point, he was 81 years old, and he lived in Cambria until he was 94. That's when he passed away. But at age 81, in 1954, he said to Mr. Gledhill that he had this advice for any family, that he urged families to keep a family record. And then it quotes, he said, "Don't leave them," meaning your descendants and family members, "don't leave them guessing as to who you were or where you came from or who their antecedents were. Give them truly something worthwhile." And so he did. Thank you.
Yeah.